Hello, nice to be with you, and sorry not to be with you in person. This seems a bit strange, certainly to me. I'm a bit of a technophobe, but when James invited me to take part, unfortunately the timing didn't quite work for me, but it's lovely to be able to contribute. My presentation today is called When What Works Doesn't Work, Performativity and the Effects of Measurement. And I hope to be able to join you for questions and discussion by Skype afterwards if that works out. If not, feel free to get in touch if you're interested and want to discuss or challenge or agree or disagree. So in today's talk, I'll be first raising some questions about what works. I'll then discuss a little bit about the research that I've been doing with Louise Doherty on grassroots youth work and its impact. Then I'll talk about some theory around performativity as a policy technology, and then look at the implications of what kind of evaluation and measurement does to practice. I want to start by mentioning the growing and important role of what works as a form of governance, and we've really seen a growing influence of what works centres and evidence-based policy, particularly since the new Labour era if we're looking at the UK. And in some senses, you know, this could be seen as a common sense good thing. Who's going to disagree with the idea that we need to know what works in practice, and the idea that policy and practice should be underpinned by evidence, of course, sounds very convincing. This is especially the case in the context today of kind of post-truth, of having a president of the United States who's a climate denier, for example. So in this context, why this challenge to the idea of what works? One of the effects that the dominance of what works has is that certain types of research and certain types of approaches to measurement are valued well above others, and then that has consequences. So as we know, randomized control trials are seen as the gold standard, and much of what works throughout the social sector is heavily informed by the medical model. Now, it's good to see that some what works centres are trying to include some qualitative research, but it remains the case that there's a real hierarchy of standards of evidence, and some research is seen as much more powerful than others. And this, I think, is not borne out by practice, because in the real messy world of practice, things are not so linear. Often something seems to work contextually part of the time, but it's inconsistent. It might work better in certain circumstances. A similar practice might appear to work better in a particular village than a different urban area, but then it's found that actually, you know, another urban area works just as well again. The differences in staff make a big difference. The differences in the people attending at that time make a massive difference. So often, on the other hand, something can appear to be working very well, but when the effect is measured, there's no effect or very little effect. It seems that much of what happens, what seems powerful, what people's accounts of the change and the benefit of being involved in a particular practice or provision, seems impossible to prove statistically. So often people involved will say it works, but it can't be proven. Does that mean they're imagining it, or they're kind of fabricating in some way? Or is that the limitation of the methods that are seen as rigorous and valid? So given these major limitations really to what works and to the dominant forms of research and evaluation that are counted within a what works framework, why is it so compelling? And I would suggest that this is because it really fits into a neoliberal logic. That's not to say that most people working in evidence and evaluation and what works centres are necessarily pro-neoliberal, but the nature of measurable, quantifiable, standardizable evidence means that things can be compared, services can be compared in a neoliberal marketplace, they can be costed, there can be competition between different services, and it really fits into that overall neoliberal logic. So when we look at the example of youth work, which is my practice background and my research area, there's really been a clash between the practice itself which is informal, which aims to be young person centred, and which young people often say they value because of how different it is from school and social work and other arenas in which they live their lives. And the clash between that and then how it's measured. And that's happened over many years, from the kind of target cultures of New Labour to the outcomes and validated indicators and so on that we're seeing a growth in today. And between these different types of monitoring, inappropriate measurement of whether it's targets or kind of impact and distance travelled and so on can really distort practice and overall provision. So both the practice that takes place in settings themselves, but also then the shape of overall provision. And I'll go on to discuss that a bit more later on. It can misdirect our attention from structural inequalities and other kind of wider economic and political issues. And it takes time and attention from other forms of evaluation that perhaps less valued in the evidence-based policy arena. I briefly want to mention the research that I've been doing that feeds into this presentation. So this is 2 studies on grassroots youth work and its impact. The first was my PhD study on how part-time youth workers experience their role in a changing policy context under the coalition government at the time. And the second study is the one I'm doing with Louise Doherty, my colleague at King's College London. It's an ESRC funded study called Rethinking Impact Evaluation and Accountability in Youth Work. Both of these studies are based on qualitative research and critical policy analysis, really centering the perspectives of practitioners and young people, and with a focus on what I'm calling open youth work. What I mean by open youth work relates to the term as it's used in other European countries, work that takes place in youth clubs and in public spaces, so it might be street-based youth work. But I use it a bit more widely than that to encompass groups based on shared identity. So they might not be exactly open access, they might be girls groups, LGBTQ groups, disabled young people's groups. I would suggest that they really share this characteristic of openness in terms of the atmosphere, the informal atmosphere. Open youth work is based on informal education, learning through conversation, through activity, through relationships with peers and with youth workers. Young people are involved on a voluntary basis, so there's that openness that they can leave, they can come when they choose, engage on their own terms. And thirdly, open in aims and approach, and often open youth work won't have a particular set or defined outcome. I'll briefly mention the research methods that we're using in the current study. The research is taking place over 4 phases. The first is policy analysis. What is this youth impact agenda and how has it come about? So we're talking to people and reading policy documents. The second phase is the one we're in the middle of at the moment, and that's doing participant observation, focus groups and interviews in 8 youth work settings. And then we'll be going on to more in-depth participative research in youth work settings. I want to elaborate now a little bit on the specific tensions in measuring youth work, but I do think some of these relate to other settings that might be relevant to the discussions on loneliness. So the kind of places, community facilities where people come, maybe elderly people's drop-ins, maybe community cafes and so on. So this is drawing both on our current research, which we're very early on, so it's kind of emerging findings from that research, but also from my previous study. So youth work and some of those other services that I've mentioned are not really an intervention. They work with and alongside, not on young people. And I think that is a really important distinction that does make it hard to measure. Part of that is about not having a specific outcome in mind. That doesn't mean that nothing does come out, but it's not going into the work with that kind of agenda of a particular thing that you want that young person to achieve. And that is changing, I think, in the current context where there is a lot of pressure on youth workers to identify outcomes. Thirdly, not usually having a clear beginning and end, so open-ended long-term work that's actually based in a community and contributes to that community. And related to that then, the work is not only about individuals, it's also about groups, neighbourhoods and communities. And it does feel that most measurements, most kind of evidence-based work still focuses on that kind of measurement of individual change rather than maybe political, social change and community change. And lastly, it tends to be fairly or even very informal and improvisatory, again making it very difficult to measure. So all of those things would be a problem at any time, in any context, but where we're sitting at the moment is in a really challenging context, and as everyone knows, there have been devastating cuts to services such as youth work, a real long-term loss of infrastructure, so a selling off of buildings, a loss of very experienced youth workers, a closure of professional courses, a real lack of confidence as that form of work begins to feel very precarious. People wanting to come into that profession start to think, well, I don't see a future in that line of work for me. And so things are extremely precarious. And why I'm mentioning this in relation to measurement is I think it cannot be ignored. There's also the wider context of inequalities and poverty that are affecting both the workers, but also the people, even more so the people using that provision or that service. And I really think this is important because it means that then when evaluation or research is being done, it begins to feel it's got very high stakes. People are very worried about their jobs, they're very worried about their services, and so however much an evaluator might have a kind of learning agenda, a developmental agenda, it doesn't feel like that on the ground, and that's certainly what we're seeing as we're going into youth settings. Practitioners, managers, young people all think, well, I need to give the right data here because I need to keep this service open. I want to talk about this idea of performativity, which is a theory developed by Stephen Ball, drawing on Leotard and others, to look at education policy and how performativity is a policy technology in which accountability measures really transform and shape the practice that's happening in educational settings. So in terms of the youth work context, how we measure is transforming what we measure, and it's also creating new ways of being. It changes not only what's done in the setting, but also who we are as workers. It changes our relationships with those we work with. So an example would be that if there's a focus on getting a certain number of questionnaires filled in, that really incentivizes workers to engage with particular groups who may be more compliant in doing those questionnaires. If certain data is wanted, then again, you know, when jobs are on the line, when services are on the line, youth workers and young people do start to think about, well, you know, what might make this data look good, and youth workers might be thinking who might be a good source of data. And I'm not suggesting they're doing that deliberately or consciously all the time, but we do see those things come into play, and it's inevitable. More widely than that, performativity means that how we measure also shapes the overall provision that's available. So in youth work, it's much more likely that targeted projects stay open because it's easier to measure the distance travelled during a 6-week project focusing on self-esteem or perhaps even loneliness than it is to do long-term work, which might map onto many different kind of outcomes and community needs and so on. That long-term work is probably much harder to pin down very specific predefined outcomes. So we've seen a real change in youth work from evaluation, the notion of how is this going, and albeit some of that evaluation was good and some of it was quite patchy, to a more kind of systematic counting and comparison of outputs and outcomes. And now we're in an era of social return on investment and social value, that kind of monetized comparison of what is this indicator, what is this change, what is this distance travelled worth in monetary terms, and how can we compare one service to another. Again, a very kind of neoliberal approach to evaluation. And this phase of neoliberalism we're in at the moment is characterised by Ian McGimpsey as late neoliberalism, as a finance capital imaginary using the metaphors and processes of investment. And I've been writing with Ian and another colleague, John Owens, about what we've called the social investment machine, which is the coming together of government, treasury policy around how services now need to be measurable in monetary terms, and the coming together of that with services such as, in the case of what we've written about, is the National Citizen Service, where young people's experiences become subordinated then as evaluation is extended. So there are very restrictive tools for expressing subjective experiences, and young people may find these questions that they're being asked intrusive, irrelevant, or just simply tedious. In this situation, young people's feelings, their behaviours, their attitudes are converted to data, and that then is calculated as a figure which can be converted into a financial return. And in this way, we are suggesting they're fed into the social investment machine. One of the elements of all of this is that there are emotions related to evaluation and to the ways in which evidence is gathered, and these emotions can be kind of neglected both in the design and the outputs of these forms of research. When I was talking recently with young people in a focus group in a London youth club, they were really viscerally sort of talking about how it felt to have forms put in their hands when they were in the youth club, and they really they didn't see their youth club in this way. They said one of the young women said that's what school is for. The thing here is outside of school. You come to play pool or whatever. You don't come here to fill in forms, you know. It's like, I'm not going there if they're going to make me fill forms. And then the other young people were agreeing. Stephen Ball writes about how policy often neoliberalises us. He writes about how us being staff in this sense, it makes us responsible and enterprising, offering us the opportunities to succeed, and by making us guilty if we do not. And I think, again, we've seen that in our research where practitioners can either feel quite guilty if, according to the impact indicators or measurements or evaluations, the data isn't what they'd want to see, or feel quite proud when it is successful. So even practitioners who are quite critical of the methods used to gather data from young people can get quite kind of seduced where this does show some kind of evidence, and I really understand that. What I do need to do now is just conclude with a few reflections on what might work, or some suggestions, and this is just a kind of early thoughts really, and I'm really interested to hear what others think. One thing that I put really centrally is valuing the perspectives of practitioners and young people, including those difficult and contradictory emotions. I'm particularly thinking about the importance of those perspectives when they're uncomfortable, when they're inconvenient, when they don't go along with what evaluators and researchers might want to see. So when young people and practitioners are saying, actually, we really don't want to fill in any forms at all, rather than jumping immediately to, oh, well, how can we make a form that you're okay with filling in? Try and be there with that discomfort and understand where that's coming from. Maybe consider and taking it very seriously. Secondly, of course, the importance of diverse and inclusive evaluation and research methods, which I know that many of you are fully engaged and involved with, and it would really be nice to see a cultural change in the evidence-based policy and practice sector around what counts as evidence, not discounting qualitative evidence. Thirdly, really centering and honouring the absolutely devastating and challenging political, economic and social context in which most practices are taking place and in which most lives are being led at the moment. Not trying to kind of just sideline that context, but looking at how does that shape the pressure that practitioners and the users and participants of services are facing when they're asked to take part in research and so on. Fourthly, acknowledging the limitations of research, acknowledging what, and really talking in more depth about what can't be measured. What are the elements of what's happening that cannot be represented by numerous research methods, and that might include qualitative methods as well. And fifthly, activism and advocacy. And I think it's important that as researchers, practitioners, evaluators, human beings, we continue to be engaged with advocacy for change and with activism for a different world. We can't change the world simply by evaluating it and simply by researching it. I think other things need to go alongside that, particularly in the current context that we're in. Thank you for listening, and I'm hoping I'll be able to join you now by Skype if possible. If not, do get in touch.